A photon is a photon is a photon. I mean, a photon is a little bundle. It's not even a particle of electromagnetic radiation. And according to the frequency cycle, is either a very short frequency cycle, in which case it's got a lot of energy, or it's a longer wavelength and it's got less energy. And all this business about different colors for different effects. Well, there's a little bit of truth in there. But that's more to do with the electron volt, which is the amount of energy that that photon's got, rather than being a magic bullet.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me in this episode is Dr. Mark Cronshaw, who is one of the world's foremost experts in the field of photobiomodulation. This is the interaction of light with biology. Photo, light, biology, and modulation is what it sounds like. This is more commonly known or thought of as being synonymous with red and near-infrared light therapy. It's technically broader than just red and near-infrared wavelengths. It includes many different wavelengths. But this whole field of red and near-infrared light therapy has really exploded in recent years. When I wrote my book, The Ultimate Guide to Red Light Therapy, back in 2017, this was really a very fringe topic. Not a lot of people were talking about it. Very few people had heard of it. If I brought it up to people, I'd say 99% of the time, most people had never even heard of the idea of red light therapy or the idea that red and near infrared light had some unique effect on human biology. It has since become totally mainstream. We see it everywhere, popping up in different facilities, med spas and gyms, and we see it in the media and on TV. Everybody knows what red light therapy is. It's fully gone mainstream, from fringe to mainstream. So my timing with the book that I wrote, which was a book really, I was passionate about this field for many, many years. I had become aware of it. Probably at that time, I was already aware of it for at least 7 or 8, maybe 10 years of this sort of unique effect of red and near infrared light. I knew clinicians. My older brother, who's a chiropractor, was using lasers in his practice, and so I was kind of following this emerging science for many, many years, prior to the existence even of LEDs. And I would reach, as soon as LEDs, I wouldn't say prior to the existence of LEDs, but prior to the existence of any red light device panels that were widely available. And at that time, I was reaching out to a marijuana growing light company to have them, to see if they could custom make panels for me in the red and near infrared wavelengths. This was before any company existed selling these red and near infrared light panels. Like, there are many, many dozens, if not hundreds of companies doing it now. And the marijuana growing light company didn't even know why they were making these weird devices at these weird wavelengths. They had no idea what I was using them for. So anyway, this was at the time something I was passionate about. I threw together kind of in my spare time. And I guess my timing was good, because my book, The Ultimate Guide to Red Light Therapy, subsequently became the most popular book in the world on that subject for a general audience. There were many textbooks that existed, clinical textbooks for researchers and clinicians, but there weren't at that time any books that existed for a general audience. So I thought to just kind of throw one together in my spare time. That book is now 8 or 9 years outdated. And it is very outdated. I've changed my mind on certain topics. The science has evolved in many ways. There's a lot of new information. So I wanted to update this and create a version 2 of this book. And that's something that I've been working on for about a year now. And as luck would have it, a very big publisher reached out to me and said, hey, how would you like to create a version 2 of this book? We see red light therapy has become very popular. It's become very mainstream. We see how popular your book is. How would you like to update it and create a new version with us? So as luck would have it, I was already planning on doing exactly that on my own. So I was very happy to partner with them. Lots more very exciting news on that front. As of now, the manuscript is almost done, and that book is going to come out later this year. Some very exciting stuff I won't announce just yet on that. I wanted to do a really great job on this new book. not only has the science evolved quite a bit, and have I evolved my own knowledge and my own thinking on many of these topics, and so, I wanted to create an excellent version 2 of this book. So what was originally sort of conceptualized as like an update to the original book, that I would just sort of refresh certain parts and keep it updated, has actually turned into basically a complete rewrite. I would say 80–90% of the content of the new book is entirely new, rather than just sort of updating this and that. It is a completely new book. And it is vastly more expansive, vastly more comprehensive, and vastly more scientifically rigorous. So I'm very, very excited for this new book. I think it's going to be awesome. I think it's going to contribute a lot of value to the world, and I hope you guys are excited about it as well. Now, in the process of writing it, one of the things that I've wanted to do is, there are these, I've known for many years, there are certain areas in PBM science that are very contentious, very controversial, where different experts and researchers and clinicians have differing opinions. Lasers versus LEDs, irradiance parameters, dosing parameters, what type of devices are best, how should you apply them? There are many topics, including many topics that are seemingly foundational, that you wouldn't think have a lot of disagreement and contentiousness, but they do. Different people have very different opinions. Sometimes people are very dogmatic in insisting, this is the one truth, this is the one right way of doing things, everybody else has got it wrong. But the reality is, different experts have very different opinions, sometimes very different opinions on surprisingly foundational concepts. And I think that's an overall sign that PBM science is still kind of in its adolescence. There's still a lot we don't know. There's still a lot of research that has to be done before we move to any kind of scientific consensus about all the different dosimetry parameters and possible devices we can use. Plus, the technology side is rapidly expanding at a faster pace than we can have the evidence to actually know, the efficacy of these different devices and so on. So there's a lot of complexity here, a lot of nuance, a lot of contentiousness. And one of the things that I wanted to do in bringing this new book to the world is interview many different experts in this field to get to basically share these points of disagreement. So I wanted to interview experts specifically who have differing opinions on different topics, to present both sides of the argument in the book and say, well, this expert thinks this other expert thinks that, and so on, to try to make sure I'm being very fair, very charitable to the different perspectives that exist, and make sure that the general audience isn't just getting one side of the story or the other. And while I'm doing these interviews, of course, I'm poking and prodding and trying to bring the opposing perspective to that research, to get to that researcher, to get them to speak to the other side of the argument, and so on. So I've done a string of conversations with Dr. Michael Hamblin, who's pretty much the most prolific researcher in the world in PBM, photobiomodulation. And he's a former Harvard professor. I think he's got over 1,400 peer-reviewed papers under his belt, author of clinical textbooks on the subject. Many conversations with him that will come out soon on the podcast. I've done a couple interviews with Dr. Praveen Irani, I think maybe 2.5 or 3 hours of interviews, who's a prolific researcher in the field as well. I've done some interviews with Tom Kerber, who has done a lot of really interesting experiments on penetration depth into the tissue, which is another area of a surprising amount of controversy in this field. And then in the process of reaching out to different experts, someone said to me, have you connected with Dr. Mark Cronshaw yet? And I said, I've seen his name on papers here and there, but I haven't spoken with him personally. He said, you got to connect with him. I'll connect you guys right now via WhatsApp. We spoke a few minutes later, and I was absolutely blown away by Dr. Cronshaw's knowledge. He just has layer upon layer of knowledge of the nuance, of the complexity of PBM science, And I was just blown away by his brilliance, by his expertise in this field. And I knew immediately this needed to be a string of podcast conversations to allow him to deliver all of this information to you guys. So this is what you're about to hear is the first of many podcasts on this topic with Dr. Cronshaw. And with that in mind, it's going to be, I suspect, 4-5 hours in total. I think at the time that I'm recording this, this little intro clip, we have probably had, I want to say maybe 4 hours of recorded conversations and maybe a few hours of non-recorded conversations as well, and tons of email exchanges. So I've been, again, really blown away by his expertise in this field. And with that in mind, though, as you might guess by the fact that it's many hours of conversation, I want to give a very strong warning to listeners here, which is that this string of conversations is not going to be for everyone. This is for probably a small subset of you guys who are really interested in going deep into the science and the complexity and the nuance and the differing perspectives of PBM science. And if you are a person, probably most of you are just, you don't really care about all the technical aspects and all the controversy and all the different perspectives among researchers, and to know all these technical terms. You just want to maybe be told, okay, go buy this device or that device and here's how to use it. This is really not the episode for you. You're probably going to be an hour or two into this and feeling very frustrated, like, I've been listening for an hour and a half already, and all I've gotten is theory and all this complexity and all these technical jargony terms that I don't even understand, and just tell me what to do and how to get the benefits of this, right? So I'm very much aware that probably most people are going to be in that camp, and that's why I want to give you this warning. Again, this is for the small subset of you that are really interested in understanding PBM science and the complexity, the nuance, a lot of the more modern progressive insights among researchers and new hypotheses that are coming out. If you want to start to understand this at a very deep level and you want to geek out on PBM science, this is for you. If you just want the simple, practical how-to guide of what to buy and how to use it, this is not for you. So with that said, let's get into the episode. Again, I think if you are in that camp of wanting to geek out on this, you are absolutely going to love this string of conversations. And with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Cronshaw. So he is a leading expert in PBM therapy, particularly in dosimetry and clinical applications. With over 40 years in dentistry and laser research, he's played a key role in advancing PBM science. He trained at Guy's Hospital in London, earning a biomedical sciences degree in 1981, before completing his dental qualifications in 1984. After postgraduate training and studying under Dr. John Coyce in the US, he established a private practice in the UK where he specializes in PBM therapies for tissue regeneration, pain management, and wound healing. He's a prolific researcher in the field of PBM science. He's published over 26 peer-reviewed papers on laser dentistry and PBM more broadly. He's contributed key chapters to clinical textbooks in this field. His doctoral research at De Montfort University focuses on optimizing PBM dose delivery and treatment protocols for use in oncology, sports physiotherapy, and neuropathic pain. This dissertation has not been published yet. It's about to be published. I've had the privilege of seeing it. He's shared it with me very generously, and it is absolutely phenomenal, and I think clarifies many, many important issues in this field, many controversial topics within PBM dosing parameters, dosimetry. Dr. Cronshaw regularly speaks at global PBM conferences, including WALT, IADR, WFLD, presenting groundbreaking work on LED-based PBM, optimal dosing, and combination PBM cryotherapy protocols. He collaborates with research teams across France, Spain, Syria, and Italy to refine PBM applications in medicine and dentistry. He's also an educator as well as a clinician. He was a professor at the University of Genoa from 2014 to 2020, teaching advanced oral laser applications. And by the way, as you'll see in this episode, which is not very common for a lot of researchers, he is also a phenomenal communicator. So, the fact that he was a professor really shows here. He also serves as a peer reviewer for lasers in medical science and photochemistry and photobiology, and sits on the board of Laser Education International. Alongside Professor Stephen Parker, he co-directs a PBM training academy focusing on dosimetry and clinical implementation. And with a specialized focus on PBM dosimetry, Dr. Cronshaw continues to pioneer new protocols and refine PBM applications, cementing his status as a global authority in PBM research and education. So with no further ado, and keeping that warning that I gave you in mind, this is only for the people who want to geek out on PBM science. Here is the first of many podcasts with Dr. Mark Cronshaw. Enjoy.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my great pleasure to be here today, Harry. It's always good when I meet someone who's a fellow enthusiast for PBM, because this is a subject that I'm very passionate about, as I know you are too. It's been a journey for me, and it's a journey which is continuing, which started off in my activities clinically, because I'm an active clinical dentist. I'm involved in private practice. I've been using lasers for surgery for many years, and I got very interested in the effects I was seeing because I saw how well things healed, how little pain the patients were having afterwards. I wanted to develop my understanding. So then I formalized my studies by studying at the University of Genoa in Italy, which is one of the early world centers of excellence for the study for photobiomodulation. And from that, ultimately, because I acquitted myself well, they took me on as the faculty. And to learn something, there's nothing quite like having to teach it. And so I got really into depth into various aspects of how surgical lasers work, but also started digging more deeply into how photobiomodulation worked, because I wanted to know how I could do this better, more reliably and predictably, and also how I could better teach it to my students, as I'm involved in dental education. This culminated in when I left Genoa in my signing up to do a doctorate, as I realized there were many questions that I couldn't answer based on the literature that I'd read or the many speakers I'd listened to, and that there seemed to be the need for me personally to go through the literature and to reappraise it and to introduce some of my own thoughts, so I could better understand the processes involved in doing this. And the outcome is now 5, 6 years on. I've now very recently published my thesis. And I think I've got a better understanding. And this is a very exciting time to be involved in PBM and PBM research, because we're at the stage in which we're now being able to take the science, the evidence base, and translate it into something which is going to be not only useful to clinicians like myself, but the target is to empower normal people to be able to do self-application of targeted PBM to start to treat some of the many ailments which are otherwise really quite difficult to manage medically. And my confident prediction is that within the next 5 to 10 years, everybody will have some sort of PBM device at home, along with the elastoplast and the Dettol. You'll have your PBM device, and it's just going to be wonderful, because this is going to open a whole new toolbox, which is it's the biggest single medical advance I've seen during the course of my career. And I think the outcome of this is just going to be an absolute game changer in many things, not just in dentistry, but in medicine. So it's my pleasure to be here today. I'll be very happy to share with you the benefits of the research that I've done. We can have a great conversation. So I very much look forward to continuing this conversation with you, Ari, and because we've got so much to talk about, we could talk for hours.
Yes, absolutely, Mark. I'm very excited to dig into this with you.
Okay. Oh,
Mark, the last little segue, I remember when we started recording, you had just finished expressing some thoughts on the the biphasic dose response, the Arndt-Schultz curve, and then you segued into
yeah.
another
Yeah.
line of thinking. Do you remember?
Yeah. Oh, I remember all that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Can you give just like a little segue into that?
absolutely. Yeah. So when I first got interested in this, I decided that I'd have to look at the literature. to see what the published science showed in regards to dissymmetry. How much energy do I need to use to produce an effect? And the classical literature indicated that there was what was known as the biphasic response, something called the Arndt-Schultz law, where it was either too little, nothing happened, get into the sweet spot and you got the happy stuff happening, and then beyond that, nothing happened at all. And so I thought, well, okay. So when I looked in the literature, my interest is not only to see how to optimize healing, but also how to inhibit pain as well as to manage inflammation. Because clinically, for me, that's very important. And as a dentist, I get to manage people who are in pain and with inflammation. I want to know how best to do it and how to treat it with my photobiomodulation therapies. And I discovered that there are actually two dose windows. There's a low dose window, which is associated with increased cellular activity, and then there's a higher dosimetry, which is associated with analgesia and the inhibition of pain. And so I then published a paper with colleagues Stephen Parker and Praveen Irani, expressing these thoughts within the context of adopting an evolutionary model in regards to trying to understand the various ways in which cells communicate internally, from which later I then turned this into a thesis, which I've spent the last 5, 6 years evolving into trying to understand exactly how to deliver the energy, what amount of energy you have to deliver, how best to deliver that energy in order to predictably and reliably produce the kind of responses that we want, as well as to develop an overview of how is it that this thing works. And now that I'm not at the end of that journey, because it's still a continued journey, nobody knows it all. It's exciting times to be able to share these thoughts with you. So I think we could talk an awful lot more. It'd be really great if we could just show you some graphics as well. I think for an educational route, if you can sort of see some images, it really does help rather than just having to focus on the word. So, with your permission, maybe in one of our future conversations, I'll show you some of my materials because visually, I think it's easier to understand complex subjects rather than just having to focus on the spoken word, And
Yeah, absolutely. I would love that.
the outcome of that Feeling the Heat review paper, I suggested that there was a multi-phase response to PBM, that it wasn't just good stuff or nothing. It would be a beneficial thing to have inhibition, because inhibition is associated with analgesia, right? And so we know what those dose windows are because from the literature reviews I'd done, I knew that there was a kind of a sweet spot between 2 through to about 8, 9 joules per square centimeter at tissue level, which was associated with an increased rate of mitosis, increased ATP, and all the positive events associated with increased mobility and activity of the immune system, etc. But above that, as soon as you get above about 10 joules per square centimeter, then you didn't see any of that. You saw inhibition, but that inhibition was associated with analgesia because the review papers on pain, and I could quote and cite the papers if you wanted to, they all indicated that you needed a higher dosimetry in order to achieve analgesia. So I thought, great, this is useful. Clinically, I've now got 2 target doses. Okay. And I thought, well, what does that correspond to in terms of the mechanics of what's happening? That photons coming into the cell, how is it it's producing one effect as opposed to the other? And so I then theorized and I realized that in the electron transport chain, there are checks and balances inherent to it because the mitochondria is like a chemical factory. It's the most incredible sophisticated thing, using all these useful products, fatty acids, proteins, ATP, byproducts. It's important associated with nitrogen metabolism and the facility that mitochondria add to eukaryota, which are multicellular things, are just absolutely mind-blowing, and but like all chemical factories, it's dangerous, because you're getting a lot of reactive oxygen species produced that can be highly toxic, and you're also getting some heat generated because as a byproduct of any chemical process, you get some heat. And If you overheat things, then you can start to damage part-formed proteins, and you can start to derail various enzymes so that they don't work properly. And that, if it's left uncontrolled, that can kill the mitochondria and it can kill the cell, And so this is all very strictly regulated. So I then went looking to see what the regulators were for internal cellular metabolism, for temperature control. And there are various ones. I mean, when the temperature is elevated by 2 degrees centigrade, then you get an activation of some protective enzymes called heat stress proteins. And there's a whole cascade of these heat stress proteins, some of which are chaperones, which kind of wrap up the heart-formed proteins to prevent them getting damaged. And some of them have got specific effects which improve the ability of the cell to survive the heat stress. But along the way, they shut down the electron transport chain. They activate ATPase, which is the thing which is driving the cell, the ATP that's generating the ETC. And there are associated effects with other protective gene sequences like P53, which just helps improve the stress resistance of the cell against cellular death caused by this stress. And then there are other things as well, such as
Uh, can I just add for people who might be listening to that talking about heat stress proteins or heat shock proteins might sound like, oh, this is a bad thing, but we have lots of evidence showing that the initiation of this heat shock protein response, which happens with exercise, which happens with sauna, is linked to a host of different beneficial physiological effects.
Absolutely. This is a process we refer to as hormesis. And
Right.
hormesis is the technical term for the cell's protective mechanisms, where the cell doesn't just survive in consequence of the hormetic influence, the stressor, it's actually more resilient. This is something which has been proven to be really important in the prevention of some of these awful complications that we've seen in cancer chemotherapy and radiotherapy, whereby preconditioning the tissues, you can increase the stress resistance of the tissues to withstand the next incoming stress. And so this concept of preconditioning, I think, is really very important in the PBM story. So apart from the HSP cascades, there are others that I found. Now, with inside the enzyme, inside the electron transport chain, adjacent to it in the mitochondria, there are some things called UCPs, and these are uncoupling proteins, right? Now, uncoupling proteins were first discovered in brown fat cells, and these are the things where, when you get cold, you start to shiver, and you're getting heat generated, and it's because of the activation of the UCP1, which opens up the gate inside of the mitochondria, and it allows the protons, which are the little hydrogen ions that have been pushed across into the inner mitochondrial matrix, back into the matrix. When you get a lot of protons there, then it really is like a big party. There's a lot of molecular vibration, and that generates heat. And so it's the natural mechanism by which you had, but there are other UCPs as well. There are about 5 sorts that have been identified, and these are present in all organs and tissues, in the brain, in the kidneys, in the liver, in muscles, anywhere where there's high metabolic activity, you've got these UCPs. And these UCPs, when they open, it's like pulling the plug on the bath, the bathwater drains out, and the bathwater being the proton gradient. And if the proton gradient's gone, then the way the electron transport chain works, it's like a hydrodynamic dam, because it's driving this little molecular rotor as this stream of protons is coming down. And as it's going along, it's taking an electron and it combines it with the phosphate, and then you've got ADP going to ATP. So if you turn off that flow of protons, you're not getting that ATP generated. And so as a result, the amount of energy available within the cell is gone. So UCPs are another regulator which is associated with temperature. because when you have an elevation of temperature, you also get an increase in the amount of reactive oxygen species. Because two key enzymes, which Praveen Irani has identified in a very nice study he did with his Harvard colleague Khan, where if you heat things above 42 degrees centigrade, there's two enzymes. One's called catalase, and the other one's called glutathione reductase. And these are very important at deactivating reactive oxygen species because reactive oxygen species can react with nitrogen within which is present in proteins and produce reactive nitrosyl species, and they're deadly poison to the cell. I mean, they kill
What?
tissues.
Sorry, go ahead. Complete the thought, and then I'd like to just add one thing.
Yeah, and so you want to avoid RNS. Now, small amounts of ROS, which is a normal byproduct of what we call aerobic metabolism, oxidative phosphorylation, this wonderful enzymic chain present in the mitochondria, are actually stimulatory, and they help activate some gene transcription sequences associated with beneficial things like an increase in mitosis, as well as the production of some very important growth factors to do with blood vessels called vascular endothelial growth factor, and a whole host of other things. There's activation of nuclear factor kappa B. I mean, it's alphabet soup, this sort of stuff. When you first look at you think, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to understand this?
When you
Yeah.
get into, all the different cascades from heat shock proteins, from all these
Ah,
different growth factor cascades, from reactive oxygen species scavengers, and yeah.
I mean, it's just at first sight you look at it and think, how can I possibly understand this? And that's why I got interested in that first study, because out of that I came up with the concept that the cell really has got three compartments. Okay, there's the mitochondria, there's the cell body, and then there's a nucleus. And in terms of evolutionary terms, the cell nucleus is a descendant of a virus. The mitochondria, the descendants of alpha proteobacteria, which have become combined inside of the chassis of the cell, which is a different genus again, which is called an archaean. And the evolutionary biologists think that this is a one-off event. And out of that menage a trois, the marriage of these three things, out come the eukaryotes, because then suddenly you've got multicellular organisms which are endothermal. They're able to generate their own heat. So you can move away from solar energy, you can move away from deep sea vents where they're getting their heat. And they're also able to manufacture prodigious amounts of all these useful biomolecules like ATP, which is just incredible because then you're able to move out of your immediate area and start to colonize, and out of that emerge all the biodiversity which we identify today. So, with this understanding of this kind of three-way switching system, I then had a way of looking at that alphabet soup and looking at it thinking, okay, now some of these things are going to be located in the outer membrane, they're membrane activated things. There's crosstalk between the mitochondria, the cytoplasm, which is the sort of like the cell chassis, as it were, and then and also the nucleus. And so I can sort of start to see a roadmap there, which helps me sieve the wheat from the chaff, because otherwise it's just so mind-bogglingly complicated. I mean, my brain just switched off, and I thought I'll never understand this.
Yeah.
And so with that frame, I was then able to start to decipher some of the processes which I associate with positive and negative activation of the mitochondria. Because mitochondria are indeed very important in regards to photobiomodulation as a mechanism, but they are far from the whole story. And over the past 5, 6 years, it's been incredibly exciting because we've had lots of fresh thinking coming in from all sorts of things. I mean, in my small way, I've contributed, but there are other great people out there like Anne Liebert and Brian Bicknell and people like this who've come up with some astonishing stuff related to photosensitivity of things in the heart, the kidneys, the brain, and deep tissues related to materials called opsins as well as TRPVs. And there are all these photosensitive reactive molecules. And you're thinking, well, why? I mean,
Mhm.
these are in deep tissues. I think this is quite remarkable. There's this photosensitivity. And then I twigged that there's really, this is an inherent thing which is built in from our evolutionary origin. Because, I mean, in terms of the single cell precursor to eukaryota, they were all incredibly photoreactive. And so the fact that that's a retained feature suggests that it's an important retained feature. So in PBM, we're selectively activating a whole series of ancient switches, which are the keys to the kingdom. Because from this, you've got activation of switches associated with important enzymes like COX-2, which is cyclooxygenase, which is the active site for the production of PGE2, which is a steroid, which is like the master switch for inflammation, and then there's a whole host of other key aspects related to photon transduction as a process where you can then start to selectively affect in a targeted manner certain pathways. So I thought, oh, this is all great. It's all starting to make sense. And
Hold on one second, Mark. Let me just. I have to interject my excitement at this because I have this feeling like you're the person that I've been wanting to speak with for years now. Because one of my biggest frustrations in health science more broadly is people who try to look at physiology, look at human biochemistry, and try to understand the picture of human health
Mhm,
without coming from an evolutionary frame.
mhm,
And I find that it just ends up in a lot of confusion and a lot of counterproductive and misguided or very myopic and reductionistic ideas when human health and physiology is looked at through that frame. And this is also specifically a frustration of mine
mhm,
in the field of photobiomodulation, where I feel there is often very much a lack of evolutionary context. People have, as you know, most of the research has historically been on lasers. And I feel like so much of this body of knowledge
mhm.
and the people who are involved in what's now called photobiomodulation, what used to be called low-level laser therapy, have really not looked at all of this from
Mhm,
an evolutionary frame. So I'm
mhm,
hearing you describe everything that you
mhm,
have just laid out over the last 5 or 10 minutes,
mhm.
and basically you are presenting the evolutionary context to properly understand what's really going on in photobiomodulation. And I'm just, as you're talking, I'm going, this is exactly what is needed in this
Oh, hey,
field.
it gets
And this
better.
is you are the person I'm excited, I've been wanting to talk to.
Well, it just gets better because I certainly wouldn't claim to know. I mean, I know a lot, and I've got my theories and my ideas, and I can explain to you how I've come to those. I can describe to you the evidence that I've used in as expressed in my thesis, as well as my current and future publications, in order to demonstrate the scientific provenance of this. But essentially, we've got the bones of an understanding where we can then start to think selectively how we might then approach tackling clinical problems. Because then, as opposed to thinking about, okay, this is a particular enzymic sequence, which wavelength are we going to use? And there's a whole heritage thing there. Oh, you
Yeah,
have to use a 632.5 helium neum. No,
exactly.
you want a
Yeah.
1064. It's great. It's a gorilla. It really gets in
And
there.
that's exactly the kind of thinking that I'm describing that just doesn't really make any clear sense from an evolutionary context.
Yeah, a photon is a photon is a photon. I mean, a photon is a little bundle. It's not even a particle of electromagnetic radiation. And according to the frequency cycle, is either a very short frequency cycle, in which case it's got a lot of energy, or it's a longer wavelength and it's got less energy. And all this business about different colors for different effects. Well, there's a little bit of truth in there. But that's more to do with the electron volt, which is the amount of energy that that photon's got, rather than being a magic bullet. You have to fire, the 632.5 in order to get that CCO activated. And I can say is now we've that's all been comprehensively debunked because a lot of the early studies very much focused on red wavelengths, but now we know we can produce these effects with blue wavelengths. We know we can produce it with mid-infrared, even far infrared wavelengths.
Well,
You've got
that I want to jump in with something, and this might lead us down a big path too early to go into all of this. But everything that you just described is maybe true, but is also not true in the sense that wavelength largely dictates penetration depth or penetration depth potential. And so even if technically blue or let's say UV or let's say far infrared wavelengths activated, let's say identical mechanisms, I don't think that's true. I
uh,
mean, it's maybe there's certainly some overlap as you're implying,
Hey,
but
Harry, we're going to have a good conversation tonight. I've got some really
okay.
interesting thoughts
So,
for you. I'll listen to you.
so hold on one second. But even if let's say let's just imagine a scenario where they all activated identical
Uh,
mechanisms at the cellular level, there would still be an enormous difference in the degree to which red and near infrared wavelengths can penetrate beneath the skin versus let's say blue or UV or far infrared.
Absolutely. That's right. Now then, let's see if I can really upset you now, Harry. Okay. Um,
You're not likely to upset me. I don't have very strong
I,
opinions on this.
I came from this from the direction of being a laser guy, and lasers are amazing things. You've got all the photons are in train, in the same space and time. It's a very intense beam. And so even on very low power, with a little laser pointer of a milliwatt, you can point it across the room and with a little lens and it will hit the opposite direction and it doesn't sort of lose its energy, as it were. It's such an intense thing that to take the line from James Bond, as he's lying there waiting to undergo gender transformation by laser. As Goldfinger is saying, with this thing, I can put a spot on the moon, he says, and indeed you can. And the early pioneers in laser research were even thinking about this might be useful for interstellar communication, because it's such an intense energy. So I had this very strong belief that if you wanted to reach subsurface targets, you needed to use a high intensity energy source because otherwise it's just not going to touch the sides. It's
Did
not
you
going to
say
get past
surface targets or subsurface targets?
subsurface targets. If you're
Okay, so
aiming
if
for
you
an
want,
Earth
in other words, if,
or a
for listeners, if
Kendra.
you want the light to go beneath the level of the skin.
Yeah, that's right. And then you needed to use something which has got the what we call the coherence, which is this property of all the photons being the same in phase and time. So it's energistically having a very different effect. I mean, the difference between that and a non-coherent source, such as a light bulb or an LED, for instance, is there. It's a chaotic source. It's like the difference between picking up a rock and throwing it at a window and taking a little handful of sand, which may weigh the same, and then just vaguely scattering it at the window. The impacts in terms of the molecular substructure are being hit by this really intense coherent wave, which is what you got when the laser's going in there. I mean, it produces an effect. Whereas if you're just dribbling at little bits of energy, it's arriving chaotically and not simultaneously because it lacks the spatial and temporal coherence of a laser beam, then it's going to produce a very different effect. And that can also be reflected in how deep it starts to penetrate. So I had this very strong conviction that, yeah, if you want to get beyond a centimeter or more into tissues, it just takes forever with a non-coherent light source. It's just
Can,
so.
can can I ask you really quick, Mark? Are you sorry? Is this the current perspective that you have
Well,
that you're articulating, or this is what you
this is
believed when you were a
this is
laser guy?
what I believed when I was a
Okay,
laser guy, right?
okay,
And
got it.
then this is something where I put a lot of time and effort and work. I was using a machine called a beam profilometer. And a beam profilometer is basically it's a special camera which looks at the amount of power emerging across a plane. So I'd have a camera up here, say, and then I've got my sample in between, and then I'd have a laser underneath here. I could then look to see what the profile of the energy was going through different thicknesses of sample. And so I did this for all the different wavelengths, different spot sizes, and different parameters associated with peak power and all this stuff, trying to
And,
unravel.
and what was the sample? It was a tissue sample.
Yeah, it was a tissue sample. Basically, I just bought some lean pork muscle from
Did
a
it have
local
skin
beef
on it
farm.
or no skin?
No skin. It was just lean muscle.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
I'm just looking as just to get an idea of what happens when photons enter into tissues of different thicknesses, okay, producing different wavelengths, different optic spots, and different parameters, of one form or another to do with peak power as opposed to average power and stuff like this. And from that, then I then published a paper which was looking at the effects of different wavelengths, which was consistent with the literature that showed that if you want to really go deepest into the tissues, you're looking at around about an 800 to an 810 nanometer near infrared laser. That there was this thing they referred to as the optic window, which is shaped a little bit like this, where on one end you got around about 600, and on the other end it's around about 1100. And because it's got relatively poor absorption inside the tissue, although there's difference in scattering, which is where it's kind of bouncing off the various substructures of the tissues, that it's because it was so poorly absorbed, you could go deeper, and the 810 was right in the sweet spot, right in the deepest bit, and I thought, yeah, great, okay, so 810, this is really going to help. But all these other wavelengths can still be having beneficial effects, okay? So I
Mark,
thought,
let me just interject one thing for listeners. So, Mark is touching upon a few really foundational topics in photobiomodulation here, kind of in rapid succession. One is there's a big contentious, very controversial area of lasers versus LEDs. This has been argued over by different experts and researchers for literally decades now, and it's still quite contentious. There are some people who say LED based light versus laser light are fundamentally different, and others who argue that at similar parameters they create similar effects. And then, you've talked about the optical window, how different wavelengths penetrate the tissue differently. And that's what this funnel that he was just describing there, sort of 600-ish nanometers up to about 1100-ish nanometers. This is the red and near infrared part of the spectrum that penetrates deeply into the tissue, whereas most other wavelengths, blue, greens, UV, far infrared energy is absorbed very much at the surface. And then you also mentioned penetration depth into the tissue, talking about different wavelengths and spot sizes. That sort of, you can think of it as the thickness of the beam of the light, and how deeply those factors, and I assume irradiance also, influence the degree of penetration into the tissues, which is also another big area of controversy in photobiomodulation. So anyway, I just wanted to help listeners sort of understand you're touching on a lot of really critical, foundational, and contentious as in PBM science.
absolutely. No, that's a very nice précis of it. Thank you. Now, the question then arises, okay, well, in that case, how is it that an LED can work, And because I was reading studies that showed nice, blinded, randomized, well-designed studies, and with my science hat on, I know what to look for. And there was one involving a device called the Nova Thor, which is like a flat bed, 840 nanometer LED bed for full body irradiation for the treatment of fibromyalgia, which is a very unpleasant muscular inflammatory disorder. And they showed in a good study over a period of about 6 to 9 months that this very clearly produced a highly beneficial, statistically significant effect in those people. Yet these are LEDs, And I'm thinking, well, it's a muscle, that's subsurface. I know from the science that when you expose tissues to an LED, you may be getting at the centimeter depth between zero point 0.2 to 0.6% of the surface energy being received at depth. Okay. Now, if you're applying, say, half a milliwatt, 500 milliwatts at the surface of the tissues for the amount of energy that is there actually reaching that muscle, you're down to maybe 2 to 6 milliwatts, which is really quite low. And it's going to take a long time before you can start to get it up to the kind of the 6 joules plus that you may then need to produce the kind of positive effects or the inhibitory
Is
effect that you're seeking.
what was that 2 to 6 milliwatts per square centimeter?
Yeah.
Okay, and I have seen. I'm curious of the numbers you just gave because in writing the relevant section for my updated book, I cited some research that was talking about 10% of the light being present at 1 centimeter of depth,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then another reduction of, so in
Mhm.
other words, a 90% loss of the light by the time you get to 1 centimeter
Yeah.
deep below the skin, and then to go down to 2 centimeters was basically another 90% loss. So by the time you get 2 centimeters deep in the tissue, you've lost 99% of the surface light. And obviously, I would imagine that differs depending on the specific light device and the irradiance, the how it's applied, and the spot size and the wavelength and things of that nature. But
Exactly.
just curious how those numbers line up
Well, I
with.
mean, when I did my literature review for my doctorate, um, I found that in the kind of wavelengths that we're looking at, in the red to near infrared, which are most commonly used for PBM, that you have, depending on the wavelength and the constituency of the tissues, between 2 to 10% with a laser, right? Not with an LED, with a laser. If you look at the
Mhm.
LED studies, and I could show you the study, I mean, there's a study by a group funded by James Carroll, who's behind Thor, with a group with Anna Yaroslavsky. And they did a study where they used an LED on the cheek, and they were using one of James's LED clusters, which is I think it's an 850 nanometer source. And they were measuring directly on the inside of the cheek using a power meter how much energy was getting through. And they also did some very sophisticated mathematical analysis using something called the Monte Carlo simulation, which is a mathematical tool where if you know the thickness of the different layers, the epidermis, the amount of fat that's present in the tissue, and this sort of stuff, then you can do an approximation which will then tell you approximately what you could expect in view of the optical parameters of that wavelength and those particular tissues, because this has all been measured by the optical physics groups in their work associated with optical imaging. And they found that there was a correlation there, that they were accurate to within about 10% using the two different methods of the power meter as opposed to the Monte Carlo simulation. That when I did my sub-analysis looking at the amount of power that was actually arriving, it was between 0.2 and 0.6% of the surface energy that was arriving at depth. Now,
At 1 centimeter of
that
depth?
one cent,
Is that through the cheek or
yes, through the cheek. They were
okay.
looking at using this potentially as a tool for treating cancer patients
Uh-huh.
extraorally, because sometimes these people can't open their mouths properly, because they're so sore. And so they thought maybe an extra oral approach would work using these LEDs. And that sort of gave me pause for thought because I then thought, okay, I know that from studies such as some of the transcranial PBM stuff, related to the treatment of Parkinson's disease, as well as other conditions like depression, traumatic brain injuries, that there are evidence-based papers there and sufficient of them to indicate that this is something which can work with an LED. I mean, in Australia, you even have people who are building their own, like lampshades, and using LEDs because they're so desperate to get access to care to treat their Parkinson's, and they were getting a positive result. And so,
Yeah, and this again may be a digression, but some of these people are these bucket hats that you're referring to are using just basic LED strips, which have I think maybe around 2 or 5, maybe up to 10 milliwatts per square centimeter in irradiance that should be too low to deliver any meaningful amount of light through the skull into the brain.
Exactly, and so there's a neurologist in Colorado called Theodore Henderson, right? Who did some studies where he was measuring in cadavers where he had some skulls, and he was measuring directly using high-powered lasers as opposed to LEDs, and he did a paper on it saying these things just don't get through the to the dermis, so how can these things possibly work, and it was like an open question, and yet we know we've got this growing evidence base showing that LEDs can just work great. So I thought, okay, so I have what I would describe as my PBM road to Damascus moment. Okay, because I spent all these years studying lasers and working out, different parameters and different wavelengths and optical spot sizes and things to do with the beam profile for a laser and how to deliver those photons to depth. And yet, apparently, that's not necessary. And I thought that just is just really perplexed me. So I then had to go right back to the drawing board again, right? And I thought,
Well,
I'm getting something
I'm
seriously wrong here.
okay. I'm curious where you're going with this because in my mind, I'm curious if you agree with this or you are going to go a different direction. The big confounding variable in those topics that basically what you're describing here, this scenario, and there's some research in humans and animal research where they've, for example, looked at altering brain health parameters
Mhm.
in by either trying to shine light directly on the brain or shining it, let's say, on the legs and the abdomen where no light is brain. We've
Yep.
shown similar results both in animals and humans,
Mhm.
which implies that the big confounding variable here is systemic effects of irradiating the bloodstream,
Mhm.
where you don't necessarily need to deliver any light directly to that target tissue.
Well, this is developing into a good conversation because I think I can offer you a number of different routes which are different in the sense that we've kind of you see in science there are multiple pathways of knowledge, right? And different groups of scientists tend to group together and do their thing, but they don't necessarily cross information. And
Yeah.
so you can end up over specialized. And so when you start to look outside of those boxes and see what other people are doing, it's surprising what you discovered. I discovered this guy called Iyengar, an Indian man, and he'd done some
The,
quite nice
the
studies.
teacher of yoga.
Yeah, well, and he did some stuff looking at the effect on melanocytes of photo irradiation. And now
Okay. I
melanocytes,
think, sorry, just where I was talking about the originator of a whole field of Iyengar yoga. I think you're referring to
yeah, it's
not
a
that
man.
person.
It's a man. Yeah, he's a different person. He's a
Yeah, yeah,
scientist.
got it.
Now, maybe related. You never know. And so now melanocytes, of course. So you live in California. I can see you've got gorgeous sunshine out the window there. And so you're quite used to the idea that photoirradiation results in melanocytes producing melanin. To protect your dermis against the harmful effects of ultraviolet light. But melanocytes are incredibly interesting because the melanocytes are actually, in terms of developmental embryology, of the same cell lines that produce the whole of the peripheral nervous system. It's something called neural crest, right? And neural crest derivatives form all of the peripheral nervous system, but they also do two things, one of which is very close to my heart because they're involved in producing teeth. In that dentine is a neural crest derivative. And so no wonder it hurts, because it's like a specialized form of nervous tissue.
Mhm.
And then the melanocytes, which are a different cell line, they don't just produce melanin. On photoirradiation, they also produce, now get this, serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and luteinizing hormone.
That all of that comes from melanocytes.
All that comes from melanocytes. So when you irradiate
Wow, I
the
didn't know that.
melanocytes, then you're
Huh.
getting all these very important neurotransmitters and hormones that are being released. Now,
Mhm.
serotonin, as you know, that's the happy drug, and which is why on a bright sunny day you feel good, and
And and all of that is Is it still UV specific, or are there other wavelengths that act on melanocytes as
No,
well?
no. I mean, there are many different wavelengths that it tends to be more the bluer, light, whiter, as it were, lights that
Interesting.
are the prime chromophores for this action, but it is a broader band effect. And so melanocytes are really photosensitive, and when you activate those melanocytes, they increase and peak in their production of these very important neurotransmitters at about 3 to 4 hours post irradiation. Now, that's something which can produce a systemic effect, all right? And I then began to think, well, okay, so that's one possible pathway, because maybe melanocytes may be involved, because the melanocytes are present in the epidermal dermal boundary. So they're right in the superficial layer, and an LED will activate the melanocytes. Okay, so I thought, okay, melanocytes, maybe melanocytes are involved. And I thought, well, what else is there in there? And I came across this amazing paper in Spy, um, which was just a short, and they were talking about how myelin, which is the outer sheath of the axon, can act like an optic probe. Now, an optic probe to me as a dentist, it's familiar, because I have this LED curing light, and I switch it on. It's got a glass probe at the end where the energy gets directed through towards the tooth, and then it activates the chemical inside of the composite, which then sets. And so myelin, the sheath around myelinated nerves, that is an optic conductor. It can transport photons along the length of the axon, including across what's known as the nodes of Ranvier, which are like the junctions where the synaptic plates. And so it goes across this. Now, we know that axons generate things called biophotons, and this is something that Anne Liebert's group have written quite a bit about. And these are naturally generated photons, where by virtue of enzymic processes in the release of the energy as things are degraded, they can also release some almost not quite subatomic, but tiny packets of photons, which have been measured and identified. And these photons then travel down the myelin sheath. And they thought that these have then started to activate transcription changes in other parts of the cell. And so
Wow.
this is the natural mechanism. And so my then
Has this been validated that
yes,
this
yeah,
effect
I
occur?
can give you,
Wow, this is
I can give you
amazing.
some studies,
Yeah.
So so this then started me thinking, well, okay, so when you start to apply an extrinsic light source to the skin, what's happening with those nerve fibers? And if you look at the anatomy, and I could show you some great graphics. I mean, I've got presentation I could show you in this. Then you can see that some of the nerve endings are actually in the epidermis, and as well as in the immediate vicinity of the epidermal dermal boundary. These are myelinated fibers, and these may be acting as pathways where you're actually helping to transmit photons into deeper layers. And so then I started thinking about, well, maybe this could explain acupuncture. As you know, when you start to stimulate it, it's superficial, and maybe that's maybe related to the generation of biophotons, because I mean it's traveling at the speed of light, and it'd be reaching very far distant targets transmitted through the spinal column up to the central nervous system, what have you. But that's my wild speculation. Um,
Mhm.
so when I thought about other pathways, then Iyengar also wrote about because he didn't talk about the myelin stuff. He was just looking at melanocytes. He also talked about optic transmission by hair. Right now, if you've got blonde hair or what's known as vellus hair, which are like little short baby hairs, these act just like photo-optic guides, and it carries the light into the dermis. And at the hair follicle, which is like the little bulb which is growing your hair, that's richly innervated. So then you've got a little pool of light going into the dermis. Now, this is something which is very important in animal behavior, because in some parts of the world, according to the season, the animals change the color of their fur, and
Mhm.
it's a photo induced response. And so, as opposed to the fur
So
being a block. That's it.
We would expect clearer or whiter hair to transmit photons better than darker hair.
Well, I mean, if you've got some shorter days, then there's going to be less activation of the production of pigment inside of the dermis, and because there's less light being transmitted there, and also it could be also affecting the manufacture and production of these natural neurotransmitters such as serotonin and noradrenaline and dopamine and what have you, which then affects the activity of the animal, which is why they start to hibernate. I mean, some people suffer from SAD, seasonal adjusted disorder, And in winter, they get the winter blues, and they buy these sort of panels, blue light in order to see if they can maintain a more active central nervous system physiology, And I mean, when I go skiing, I get a really intense blast of light, and it's a tonic. I feel great, in the winter months because it helps activate all these natural sequences. So I thought, okay, so we've got melanocytes, we've got hair, we've got the potential that myelin itself may be a pathway. And I thought, well, what else? And I thought, well, maybe we're just looking at this from the wrong perspective. I mean, all the work in PBM is based on tissue culture and small animal studies, and they've been looking at things in the petri dish, and they're saying, oh yeah, yeah, this photon at this particular parameter of this particular wavelength is generating this response. Okay. And which is correct.
And just a quick side note, the fact what you just mentioned, the fact that so much research has taken place in vitro experiments in cells in a petri dish,
Yeah.
also has, I think, curious to get your thoughts on this. Maybe we'll get into this probably in the next conversation in greater depth, but I think it's also led to a very distorted picture of proper irradiance and dosing parameters because cells in a petri dish are likely to be vastly more photosensitive than cells in a living human body.
And also they're in isolation. It's a monoculture as opposed to a tissue. And
Mhm.
I mean, so you can if you're looking at it in terms of an isolated cell group, the effect is going to be very different than if it's in a mixed tissue where there's an immune system, and then you've also got circulation and all sorts of extrinsic influences are operating. Because the human body is highly complex in the sense that you have multiple overlays of systems. You've got your endocrine system, you've got your central nervous system, you've got local regulators, some of which are temperature sensitive, and then there are other factors to do with the nature of the tissue itself. And yet this beautiful machine, it just works incredibly well. There's this communication system. And so this may in part explain why you can start to produce distant effects, and again, Anne Liebert's group have done, as you mentioned earlier, some work where they've been irradiating the gastric and intestinal tract externally and producing effects which
Is that in animals or humans?
in humans, where they've been
Really?
producing some of the similar effects in terms of the benefits that you would see for a transcranial device. Now,
Wow.
that is something else, and I'm thinking, well, this must be a systemic effect, or maybe it's working through the vagus nerve. I don't know, But so having had this kind of thinking, I'm thinking, okay, well, it's not to say that the other mechanisms are wrong, far from it, but there's obviously a lot more happening. So let me carry on with the story, Eric, because it's a great story. All right.
And Mark, I just want to let you know I have about 5 minutes, and this conversation is fascinating. I feel like I want to talk to you for the next 5 hours, and I suspect that I'm still waiting for the part, by the way, that you're going to upset me. I don't know if you've gotten to that yet, but you have not upset me at all. I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm very, very excited to talk to you, and I feel like this is probably going to have to be at least a 3 or 4 part series to
Well,
get to all these layers of knowledge that it's very obvious that you have. So, fascinating stuff. But please continue. I have about 5 more minutes before I
okay.
gotta go.
Well, you wanted to know about temperature, okay? So
Mhm.
let's talk about temperature. Now, in certain circles, this is heresy. Photobiomodulation is not a photothermal response. And I'm in agreement with Mike Hamblin there. And I say, well, no, that's not true. I mean, you see, if you go for this multiphasic response by triggering off this inhibitory mechanism inside the cell to switch off axonal activity, which is what happens when you elevate the tissue temperature by 2 degrees centigrade with the HSPs and the UCPs and what have you, which mothballs cellular activity, that's a highly useful event. And I would regard that as much biomodulation as the excitatory things. It's semantics, and the other thing is, well, okay, but can you have too much of a good thing? Praveen says 42 degrees centigrade. Actually, above about 42 degrees centigrade, two key enzymes are deactivated, and then there is an ascending risk. But then this morning, first thing, I had a really hot cup of coffee, my lips are still there, and so it's to do with time and duration as well as the temperature. And this again is very well described in literature from other parallel fields. We know exactly how long you can expose tissues to at certain different temperatures before you start to see signs of tissue damage. And Praveen actually did a study on this. So by virtue of the fact that in any phototransduction process, particularly with near infrared, you're going to get some heat, then it is an inherent property. But I'll finish by saying that there is a world of difference between the effects of a heat source and PBM. And at that point, I'm not going to say anything more because I'm going to hold you on tenterhooks until we meet again because there's a lot.
I think everything you just said. So I follow it, but I think you're speaking on such a high level that it will probably be over listeners' heads as far as exactly what you're referring to. And there's a whole controversy around. I'm just explaining to the listeners now. There's a whole controversy around tissue heating during photobiomodulation, and that's what Mark was just speaking to here. Some people have put forth the idea that photobiomodulation should be non-thermal, or is by definition non-thermal. So it's mechanisms that are active in the cells in response to light that don't involve heating the tissues. And further, some people have put forth the idea that increasing the temperatures of tissues to the degree that there is a heating effect happening during photobiomodulation, that means it's not true photobiomodulation. And then another layer of this story is the idea that heating the tissues not only is, in terms of semantics, is not true photobiomodulation, but is harmful to the cells. And above a certain temperature, what Mark was just referencing there is something that was discussed in the podcast I did with Praveen Irani, where he talked about his research on heating during photobiomodulation, and above 42 degrees Celsius, you start to get deactivation of free radical reactive oxygen species scavengers. So hopefully you guys follow that, but basically there's a contentious issue around heating of the tissues during photobiomodulation, and there are some somewhat differing perspectives on that issue, and that's what Mark was speaking to there.
Absolutely. So the long short it is that when that photon interacts with your biological target, you're producing a variety of effects. One is going to be photochemical, another it can be photothermal, another it can be photomagnetic, it can be photofluorescent, and it can be photoacoustic, or it can be photoelectrical. It's an electromagnetic force. And so the effects on the target will depend on the resonance frequency of the particular target it hits, as well as the intensity of the energy that you're applying. And you can start to produce multiple effects. So it's not just single hitting that magic switch to turn on CCO to produce more ATP. You're producing multiplanar effects within the context of a 3D entity, which can be quite a big creature, like myself and you yourself. And there's all these other interplays of an endocrine system and a nervous system. So I think this oversimplified concept of PBM as being a 2D planar cellular event, you got to take a much bigger and wider perspective on it. Because when we start to think about high energy PBM, which is a really exciting area in PBM research at the moment, which I'm involved in, then you can then start to think, well, what are the safety features of it? What can you safely achieve? Is this going to improve outcome? And that's for a whole different conversation. So we've got a long road to ahead of us, Ari. I'm sorry,
I,
it's a brain twister.
I see that's exactly my thought. I feel like we have a very long road. You have so many layers of knowledge that I'm very excited to dig into with you. And I feel like you're just scratching the surface of this whole landscape of all this mind-blowing stuff. You have me very, very intrigued and very excited to continue this conversation.